there is a temperature at which the human body simply stops working, and it is far lower than you would ever guess. Not some impossible desert number, but a combination of heat and humidity that a healthy person, resting in the shade with all the water they can drink, cannot survive for more than a few hours. Today, more than 200 heat warnings are stretched across the United States, and almost no one living under them knows that ceiling exists, or that the planet has already brushed against it in a handful of places. The heat outside your window is only the first quiet step toward it, and the real question is how much of the Earth reaches that ceiling within your lifetime. If the Sky Lab has ever changed the way you look at the sky, take a second to like this video and subscribe, because this is the thread I will keep pulling all summer long, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and how hot it has gotten where you live. Trust me, you will want to stay with this one all the way to the end. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The 4th of July that was never about the heat. Right now, as you watch this, more than 230 warnings are stretched across the United States like a rash. On the 4th of July of all days, the National Weather Service has the country wrapped in 23 separate extreme heat warnings, 3 heat watches, and more than 50 heat advisories, and the air pressing down on the eastern half of the nation feels less like summer and more like something with weight to it. In the corridor between Washington and Baltimore, the heat index is climbing between 105 and 110 degrees, and the local forecasters, who are not paid to be dramatic, chose the word anomalous. In New York, the weather office wrote a single sentence that should stop you cold, even in this heat. They wrote that heat kills more people than any other weather hazard. Not floods, not lightning, not tornadoes, heat. You have heard all of this before in one form or another. You have heard that it is hot, that records are falling, that you should drink water and check on the elderly and stay out of the sun in the afternoon. That is the story every summer tells now, and if that were all this was, you could close this video and go back to your holiday, and you would be right to. But I want to be honest with you from the first minute, because there is a reason I am not opening on the temperature. The temperature is not the story. The temperature is the doorway, and what is on the other side of that doorway is a fact about the human body that almost no one carries around with them, a fact that turns every one of these heat waves from a summer inconvenience into the leading edge of something with an actual endpoint. Here is the fact. Your body has a maximum, not a preference, not a comfort zone, but a hard physical ceiling, a temperature above which you cannot survive no matter how young you are, no matter how much water you drink, no matter how much shade you find or how still you sit. It is not a matter of toughness. It is not a matter of acclimatization. It is thermodynamics, the same physics that governs engines and refrigerators and stars, and it does not negotiate. Above a certain combination of heat and moisture in the air, the human body simply stops being able to cool itself, and once that happens, the clock starts, and the clock is short. Most people have never heard that ceiling described, because for most of human history it did not matter. The planet almost never produced that combination, so the limit sat there, theoretical, like the maximum speed of light or the pressure at the bottom of the ocean, true but irrelevant to daily life. That is what is changing. That is the terrifying implication I promised you in the title, and I chose that word carefully, because it is not the heat wave outside your window that should unsettle you. It is what the heat wave is a preview of. The line exists. The planet has started in a few places to touch it, and the direction we are travelling decides how much of the Earth reaches it, and when. Let me give you the shape of where we are going, so you're not just along for a scary ride. We are going to start with your own body, because you are carrying the evidence for all of this inside your skin, and you need to understand exactly how the cooling system works, and exactly how it fails. Then I'm going to give you the number, the specific temperature that marks the ceiling, and then I'm going to take that number away from you and give you a worse one, because the real limit turned out to be lower than the scientists first believed. From there we go to the map, to the handful of places on Earth where this line has already been crossed. Briefly, in the real world, not in a model. Then we go to the future, to the research that tries to answer how much of the planet crosses that line in the lifetime of a child born today. And finally, because this planet has a memory far longer than ours, we're going to go back tens of millions of years to the 2 times in the ancient past when the Earth itself ran this experiment and left the answer written in the rock. But it starts here, today, with this heat wave, because I do not want you to think of any of this as abstract. The people living it right now are your entry point into the whole story. Consider what the forecasters are actually describing. In Philadelphia, this is the 4th day in a row of dangerous heat, and the office noted something that matters more than the daytime peak. They said the impacts are worsened by the multiple days of heat, because the danger is not really the single hot afternoon. The danger is that it does not stop. Down in Houston, the heat index is sitting between 107 and 109 degrees. In Miami, it is reaching 110. And over the mid-Atlantic, the atmosphere is doing something the local meteorologists flagged as unusually steep, a profile of the air overhead that they almost never see in that part of the country, which is helping load the same afternoon with violent thunderstorms, heat and storms pouring off the same ridge of high pressure on the same holiday. Now, I want you to notice something about how your own mind is reacting to those numbers, because it reveals the exact blind spot this whole video is built around. When I said Houston is at 109, or Miami at 110, some part of you probably filed that as bad but familiar. 110 degrees sounds hot but survivable. People live in Phoenix. People visit Death Valley for fun and take photographs next to the thermometer, and that instinct, that a big temperature number is uncomfortable but not deadly, is not wrong, exactly. It is just measuring the wrong thing, because the number that decides whether heat can kill you is not the one on the thermometer at all. It is a different number, one your local forecast almost never says out loud, and once you understand it, you will never look at a heat index the same way again. Think about what your body is actually doing right now to keep you alive. You are, at this moment, running a small furnace, every cell burning fuel, every muscle contracting, your brain alone drawing power like a light bulb that never switches off, all of it producing heat as a byproduct, all day, every day, whether you move or not, and your body has to get rid of that heat as fast as it makes it, because you are only stable inside a shockingly narrow window. A few degrees of core temperature up from normal, and you're in serious trouble. A few more and your proteins begin to fail, your organs begin to cook, and the system that is you begins to come apart, so your body is, above everything else, a machine for dumping heat, and it has a few ways to do it. It can move warm blood to the surface of your skin and radiate the heat away, which works beautifully when the air around you is cooler than you are. But when the air gets as warm as your skin, around 95 degrees, that method stops working, because heat will not flow from a cooler thing to a warmer thing. At that point, your body has exactly one tool left. One. And that tool is sweat. Sweating is a genuinely elegant piece of engineering, and it is the hinge that this entire video turns on, so stay with me. When sweat sits on your skin and evaporates, turning from liquid into vapor, it carries an enormous amount of heat away with it. That is not a metaphor. Evaporation is a cooling process. The same reason stepping out of a pool on a breezy day makes you shiver even in summer. Your body floods your skin with water precisely so that it can evaporate and haul your excess heat up into the air. On a hot, dry day, this works so well that a person in the desert can survive air temperatures that sound impossible, because the bone-dry air drinks the sweat off their skin almost as fast as they can produce it. That is the secret Phoenix and Death Valley are quietly relying on. It is not that the heat there is gentle, it is that the air is thirsty. And that single word, thirsty, is where the whole thing breaks. Because evaporation only works if the air has room to accept more moisture. If the air is already saturated, already thick with water vapor, already as wet as it can get, then your sweat has nowhere to go. It stops evaporating. It just sits there, pooling on your skin, soaking your shirt, running off you uselessly, carrying none of your heat away because it is not turning into vapor at all. And in that moment, on a day that might not even feel record-breaking on the thermometer, your last cooling tool has been taken from you, and the furnace inside you keeps burning with nowhere to send the heat. That is the real danger, and notice how completely it inverts what your instincts told you. It is not the highest temperature that kills, it is the combination of heat and humidity together, and of the two the humidity is the silent partner, the one nobody watches. A dry 115 degrees can be survived, a humid 95 can kill you. And the places on this planet that manufacture the deadliest version of that combination are not the deserts at all. They are the warm, wet coastlines and the flooded green river valleys. The places that feel green and alive. The places where a warm sea or a field of irrigated crops pumps the lower atmosphere full of moisture until the air simply cannot drink one more drop. To really feel why the ceiling matters, you have to understand how absurdly narrow the safe zone actually is. Your core temperature, the temperature far inside your chest and your skull where it counts, sits at around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and your body fights to hold it there with the stubbornness of a thermostat that has exactly one setting. Push it up by just 2 or 3 degrees, and you have a fever that puts you in bed. Push it to around 104 degrees, and you're into heat stroke, where the brain begins to misfire, where confusion and slurred speech and collapse take over. Push it just past 107 degrees, and the proteins inside your cells begin to come apart, and the damage becomes the kind that does not reverse. That is the entire window. Less than 10 degrees measured on the inside separates an ordinary afternoon from a fatal one. Everything your body does in the heat, all the sweating and the flushing and the racing pulse, is in service of defending that thin band, and the wet bulb ceiling is simply the point where the defense becomes impossible. Notice how differently this behaves from almost every other danger we are built to fear. A fire announces itself. A flood rises where you can watch it climb. A predator can be run from. Humid, ceiling-approaching heat does none of that. In the early stages, it feels like nothing more than a sticky, exhausting day, the kind you have pushed through 100 times without a second thought. There is no dramatic signal, no moment when your senses scream that a line has been crossed, because the line is being crossed on the inside, in a number you cannot feel directly. People who die in heat waves often do not understand what's happening to them until they are already far into it, because the body's quiet distress does not match the size of the threat. That mismatch between how mild it feels and how lethal it is exactly why the ceiling is so dangerous, and exactly why almost no one carries it around in their head the way they carry a fear of drowning or falling. And here is the piece that makes today's heat wave the perfect teacher. The reason the eastern half of the country feels so oppressive right now is not only the temperature on the thermometer, it is the moisture riding along with it. The same moisture that pushes the heat index into the danger zone and, in the worst conditions, pushes the wet bulb temperature toward its ceiling. When the forecasters in New York and Philadelphia warn that the humidity is making the heat feel worse, they are, without ever using the words, describing the exact mechanism that turns ordinary heat into the kind that kills, the slow closing of the body's evaporative exit. So the heat wave outside is not a separate thing from the science we are about to explore. It is a living demonstration of the first rung on the staircase, playing out in real time over the heads of tens of millions of people who mostly have no idea that the stickiness they are complaining about is the same physical quantity that sets the outer limit of human survival. So when I tell you that today's heatwave has an implication you are not ready to hear, this is the beginning of what I mean. The danger in the air is not fully captured by the number your weather app is showing you. There is a hidden number underneath it, a measurement that combines the heat and the moisture into a single value, and that hidden number has a ceiling. And above that ceiling, the human body fails in a way that has nothing to do with how strong or careful you are. Scientists have a name for that measurement, and they have pinned down, with laboratory precision, exactly where the ceiling sits. It is one of the most important numbers on Earth, and it is one of the least known. In the next few minutes I am going to give it to you, and I am going to warn you now, before I do, that the number is going to sound survivable, almost mild, and that is exactly what makes it so dangerous to underestimate. Part 2. The number that closes the exit. The number has a strange and humble name. Scientists call it the wet bulb temperature, and to understand why, you have to picture one of the oldest and simplest instruments in all of weather science. Take an ordinary thermometer, the kind that measures the temperature of the air, and wrap its bulb, the little reservoir at the bottom, in a wet cloth. Now blow air across it. As the water in that cloth evaporates, it cools the thermometer down, exactly the way evaporating sweat cools your skin. So the wet bulb thermometer does not read the temperature of the air. It reads the lowest temperature you could possibly reach by evaporating water into that air. And here is the beautiful, terrible thing about it. That wet cloth is a tiny model of you. It is a stand-in for your own sweating skin. The wet bulb temperature is, quite literally, a measurement of how well the atmosphere will let you cool yourself. When the air is hot but dry, the wet cloth cools down dramatically, far below the actual air temperature, because the thirsty air pulls the water off it fast. The wet bulb reading comes out low, and a low wet bulb reading is the atmosphere telling you that your sweat will work, that your exit is open. But when the air is hot and already soaked with moisture, The water in the cloth barely evaporates, so the thermometer barely cools, and the wet bulb reading climbs up close to the actual air temperature. A high wet bulb reading is the atmosphere telling you the opposite. It is telling you that evaporation has stopped mattering, that your sweat is just decoration now, that the exit is closing. So the question that decides whether a given day can kill a healthy person is not how high the air temperature climbs. It is how high the wet bulb temperature climbs. And in 2010, two scientists named Stephen Sherwood and Matthew Huber sat down to work out exactly where the ceiling was. They asked a simple, chilling question. At what wet bulb temperature does the human body lose the ability to shed its own heat entirely, so that survival becomes impossible not for the sick or the old or the exhausted, but for anyone, for a healthy adult resting in the shade with all the water they could want? And they found the answer. They published it in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world. The number is 35 degrees Celsius, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, on the wet bulb scale. I told you it would sound survivable, and there it is. 35 degrees Celsius, 95 on the Fahrenheit scale. You have stood in 95-degree weather. You have probably complained about it and then gotten on with your day. So how can that possibly be the temperature of death? And the answer is the single most important thing to understand in this entire video, so I'm going to be very precise. That is not 95 degrees of ordinary air temperature. That is a wet bulb temperature of 95 degrees, and to reach a wet bulb of 95, the air has to be carrying a staggering load of moisture at the same time as its heat. A wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius happens when the air is around 95 degrees Fahrenheit and the humidity is at 100%, or it happens when the air is a searing 115 degrees and the humidity is around 50%. Either way, you are talking about air that is both very hot and very wet at the same time, and that combination is far rarer and far deadlier than either one alone. Now let me tell you what actually happens to a person held at that ceiling, because the abstraction of a number does not do it justice. At a sustained wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees, your skin can no longer offload heat to the air, and your sweat can no longer evaporate, so the heat your body keeps producing, that furnace that never switches off, has nowhere to go. It stays inside you. Your core temperature, which your body defends at around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit with everything it has, begins to rise, and it does not stop rising, because there is no mechanism left to stop it. Within a matter of hours, in the estimate that comes out of this work, roughly 6 hours for a healthy person at rest, your core climbs into the range where proteins unfold and cells begin to die, where the brain swells and the organs fail in sequence, and a person who did nothing wrong, who found shade and drank water and stayed calm, dies of the heat anyway. 6 hours. In the shade. With water. That is what the ceiling means. And I want you to sit with how alien that is, because we are not built to believe it. Every survival instinct you have tells you that if it gets too hot, you find shade, you drink, you rest, and you wait it out. That instinct has kept our species alive for a very long time, across deserts and jungles and brutal summers, because for all of human history it worked. There was always an exit, shade always helped, water always helped, staying still always helped. The thing that makes the wet bulb ceiling so genuinely new, so far outside our inherited wisdom, is that above it none of those things help. You can do everything right and still not survive, because the problem is no longer about behaviour. The problem is that the air itself has stopped being able to accept your heat, and no amount of human cleverness at the individual level changes the physics of evaporation. This is the first time I want to plant the through line of this whole story firmly in your mind, and I am going to keep returning to it. There is a temperature at which being careful is not enough. That is what we are really talking about, not discomfort, a ceiling. You might be wondering why you have never heard this number if it is so important. Part of the answer is that, until very recently, it genuinely did not come up because the planet almost never got anywhere near it. And part of the answer is that the wet bulb temperature is not what gets reported to you. Your weather app shows you the air temperature and maybe the heat index, which is a related but different and more forgiving measure designed for everyday comfort. The wet bulb temperature lives mostly in scientific papers and in the quiet calculations of the people who study the limits of human physiology. It is the number underneath the number, and for most of the 20th century, the highest wet bulb temperatures ever recorded anywhere on Earth topped out somewhere in the low 30s Celsius, comfortably, if that is the word, below the 35-degree ceiling. The line was there, but nothing on the planet was tall enough to reach it. It was a limit the way the edge of a cliff is a limit to someone standing in the middle of a field. Real, but not yet relevant. That is the world we grew up in, and it is the world that is ending, quietly, without most people noticing. Because the thing about a warming atmosphere is that it does not just raise the temperature, it raises the moisture too, and it does so through a piece of physics so reliable that it has a name and an equation attached to it, worked out in the 1800s. The rule is this. For every 1 degree Celsius that you warm the air, that air can hold roughly 7% more water vapour, 7% more moisture per degree. So as the planet warms, the air over those warm seas and flooded valleys does not just get hotter, it gets wetter, and both halves of the wet bulb recipe, the heat and the humidity, climb together. That is why a warming world is not simply a hotter world. It is a world where the specific, rare, deadly combination that pushes the wet bulb temperature toward its ceiling becomes less rare, season by season, decade by decade. The cliff has not moved. We are walking the field toward it. I covered the raw physiology of this ceiling in a video just a few days ago, and if you watched it, you already understand why sweat is everything and why humidity is the killer. But I brought you back to it today for a reason, and the reason is that last time we were standing at the edge looking down at the present, at the heat wave in front of us, and the bodies it endangers right now. Today we are turning around to look at the road behind us and the road ahead, because the ceiling is not just a fact about this summer, it is a fact about the century. And to see where the century is going, you first have to know exactly how high the ceiling really is. Which brings me to a problem, and it is a problem that makes everything I have just told you worse. It is worth pausing on how old and how humble the wet bulb measurement really is, because it grounds this whole frightening idea in something reassuringly ordinary. Meteorologists have been measuring wet bulb temperature for well over a century, using an instrument so simple you could build one at home. In its classic form it is called a sling psychrometer, and it is nothing more than 2 thermometers mounted side by side, one with a dry bulb and one with a wet cloth around its bulb, that you whirl around on a handle to force air across them. The dry thermometer reads the air temperature, the wet one reads the wet bulb temperature. The gap between the two tells you how thirsty the air is, how much room it has left to accept moisture. This is not exotic future science. It is the same basic physics that has hung on the wall of weather stations since long before anyone worried about a warming planet. What has changed is not the instrument. What has changed is that the reading it gives is creeping toward a number that used to be purely academic. Let me make the difference between dry heat and humid heat concrete, because it is the thing most people get exactly backwards. Picture 2 cities on the same day, both reading 105 degrees Fahrenheit on the ordinary thermometer. The first is a desert city, where the air is bone dry, the humidity down around 10%. In that city, your sweat evaporates almost the instant it reaches your skin, hauling your heat away so efficiently that the wet bulb temperature might sit down around 23 or 24 degrees Celsius, nowhere close to the ceiling. It is brutally hot, but your cooling system is working at full power, and in the shade with water you are in no real danger. Now picture the second city, on a warm coast, where the humidity is up around 70%. Same 105 on the thermometer, but now the air is already half full of moisture, your sweat barely evaporates, and the wet bulb temperature climbs up toward 31 or 32 degrees Celsius, into the range where the human body starts to lose the fight. Same number on the app. 2 completely different levels of danger. The thermometer lied to you. The wet bulb temperature told the truth. This is also why the heat index you see on your weather app, useful as it is, does not quite capture what we're talking about. The heat index was designed to describe how hot it feels to a person, a comfort measure, and it tops out its warnings well before it captures the true physiological ceiling. The wet bulb temperature is a harder, colder thing. It does not care how hot it feels, it cares only about the physics of whether your sweat can still do its job. And that is precisely why it is the number that matters, when we start asking not how uncomfortable a place will be, but whether a human being can survive in it at all. Keep that distinction close, because everything that follows, every map and every projection and every ancient catastrophe, comes back to this one measurement and the ceiling it is quietly approaching. Because the 35-degree number, that famous ceiling published in 2010, was a theoretical calculation. It was worked out on paper from the principles of physics, assuming an idealized human being under idealized conditions, a perfectly efficient cooling machine with nothing else going wrong. And for years that number, 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb, was quoted everywhere as the limit of human survival, the red line, the point of no return. It became the number that scientists and journalists reached for whenever they wanted to describe the edge. But a theoretical limit and a real one are not always the same thing. Real human beings are not idealized machines. Real human beings have blood that has to be pumped, hearts that can only work so hard, skin that does not cover every surface perfectly, and 100 small inefficiencies that the pure physics leaves out. So a group of researchers decided to stop calculating and start measuring. They decided to take real people, put them in a sealed chamber, and find the actual wet bulb temperature at which a living human body begins to lose the fight. And when the results came back, the number was not 35. The number was lower, which means the ceiling we have all been quoting, the one that already sounded frighteningly close, was too generous. The real one is closer than that, and that is where we go next. Part 3. Lower than the number they gave you. At Pennsylvania State University, in a research program built specifically to study the limits of human heat tolerance, scientists did something the earlier work could not. They stopped trusting the idealized math and went looking for the real edge, using real, living bodies. They brought young, healthy volunteers into an environmental chamber, a room where they could dial the temperature and the humidity to any combination they wanted. They had each person swallow a tiny sensor, a capsule that measures core body temperature from the inside as it travels through the digestive tract, so the researchers could watch, in real time, the one number that actually matters, the temperature far inside the body. And then they slowly, carefully turned up the heat and the moisture, and they watched for the exact moment when a person's core temperature stopped holding steady and began to climb. That moment has a name. The researchers call it the critical environmental limit, and it is the real-world version of the wet bulb ceiling, the point where the body's cooling can no longer keep pace with the heat, where the internal temperature starts its slow, unstoppable rise. And when they found it, in humid conditions, it did not sit at the famous 35 degrees Celsius. It sat lower. In their experiments, the critical wet bulb temperature for young, fit, healthy adults came in closer to 30.5 or 31 degrees Celsius. Not 35, around 31. I need you to understand why that gap, those few degrees, is so much more alarming than it sounds. A drop from 35 to 31 does not feel like much when you say it out loud. But remember what the wet bulb temperature is measuring. It is measuring a rare and specific combination of heat and moisture. And because that combination is rare, lowering the threshold even slightly means that far more places on far more days can reach it. You have moved the finish line closer, and in doing so, you have let a whole crowd of contenders into the race that were nowhere near it before. Regions that would essentially never touch a wet bulb of 35 degrees can, and do, reach 31. The old number described a distant, almost science fiction future. The new number describes conditions that the hottest, most humid corners of the planet are brushing against already. And there is one more piece of this that the experiments made brutally clear, and it is a piece that applies directly to the people living through this holiday heatwave right now. The volunteers in those chambers were young and healthy, chosen precisely because they represent the strongest version of the human cooling system. That means the 31-degree figure is the optimistic one. It is the limit for the people best equipped to survive. For everyone else, the limit is lower still. For older adults, whose hearts pump less forcefully, whose skin sweats less efficiently, whose sense of thirst has dulled and whose bodies simply cannot move blood to the skin the way a 20-year-old can, the ceiling drops further. And this matters enormously, because when heat waves kill, they do not kill a random cross-section of the population. They kill the old. They kill people with cardiac conditions and lung conditions. They kill the poor, the isolated, the ones living alone in an upstairs apartment with no cooling and no one checking in. The New York Weather Office, in that same warning I read you at the start, was not being poetic when it said heat is the deadliest hazard. It was describing a pattern that repeats every single time, in every deadly heat wave in modern history. And the pattern is that the ceiling for the most vulnerable is far below the number in the textbooks, Which brings me to the part of this that almost nobody thinks about, and that quietly does most of the killing. We have been talking about the daytime peak, the worst hour of the afternoon, but the human body can endure a brief brush with dangerous heat if it gets a chance to recover afterward. The recovery happens at night. When the sun goes down and the air cools, your core temperature settles back to normal, your pulse eases, the strain of the day drains away, and you reset, ready to face the next day. That nightly reset is not a luxury. It is a physiological necessity, and the thing that turns a survivable heatwave into a lethal one is when the nights stop cooling down. When the air stays thick and warm through the darkness, when the overnight low refuses to drop out of the 80s, the body never gets its reset. The heat load accumulates, night over night, day over day, and a person who was merely uncomfortable on the first day is in genuine danger by the third or the fourth. Not because any single afternoon was catastrophic, but because the recovery never came. Look again at what the forecasters are describing in this current heatwave, and you will see this exact mechanism in the language. In Philadelphia, the office stressed that this is the fourth consecutive day, and that the multiple days are what worsen the impact. Across the mid-Atlantic, the overnight lows are getting stuck in the 70s, and even the low 80s. That is the signature of the dangerous kind of heat, the kind that does not let go after dark, and we have seen where this pattern leads, in disasters that are not projections or models but history. In the summer of 1995, a heatwave settled over Chicago and refused to release its grip at night, and over the course of about a week, more than 700 people died, many of them elderly, many of them alone, many of them behind windows they were afraid to open. The daytime temperatures in Chicago that week were extreme but not otherworldly. It was the relentlessness, the failure of the nights to cool, that turned a hot spell into a mass casualty event in a modern American city. And then there is the one that still stops climate scientists cold when they talk about it, because it broke the rules they thought they understood. In late June of 2021, a dome of high pressure parked itself over the Pacific Northwest, a region famous for its mild, grey, drizzly summers, a place where many homes did not even have air conditioning because they had never needed it. The temperatures that arrived were not just records, they shattered records by amounts that are supposed to be statistically almost impossible. A small town in British Columbia called Lytton reached 49.6 degrees Celsius. In Fahrenheit, that is 121 degrees. In a temperate rainforest climate near the border with Canada, a place that should never see numbers like that. The town of Lytton set the all-time Canadian heat record one afternoon, and the very next day it burned to the ground in a wildfire. And across British Columbia in that single event, an estimated 600 more people died than would have in a normal week, most of them from the heat itself. The Pacific Northwest was not supposed to be able to do that. The model said an event like that should happen once in thousands of years. It happened anyway. I am telling you about Chicago and Lytton not to pile up horror, but because they are the proof of concept for everything the ceiling implies. They show that heat already kills at scale in wealthy modern countries right now, before we have even reached the wet bulb limits we have been discussing. Neither Chicago in 95 nor the Pacific Northwest in 2021 actually reached that 31-degree wet bulb ceiling. They did not have to. People died in large numbers well below it, because real human vulnerability, the age and the illness and the isolation and the sleepless nights, does its work in the space beneath the theoretical limit. The ceiling is not the temperature at which heat starts killing people. Heat kills people far below the ceiling. The ceiling is the temperature at which it stops being possible for anyone to survive at all. Those are two very different lines, and we are talking today about a world that is walking toward the second one while already losing people to the first. It helps to understand what is actually failing inside the body as it approaches that limit, because it is not really the skin that gives out first. It is your circulation. When you overheat, your body's first move is to send enormous amounts of blood toward the skin, trying to carry the heat from your core out to the surface where it can be shed. But that blood has to come from somewhere, and it is pulled away from your organs and your muscles, even as the pump driving your blood is forced to work faster and faster to move it all. In a young, strong person, your circulation can keep up with that demand for a long time. In an older person, or someone with a weakened cardiovascular system, or someone on certain common medications that blunt the body's heat response, the circulation simply cannot sustain that pace. The cooling effort itself becomes a cardiovascular emergency. This is why so many heat deaths are officially recorded as circulatory failure. The heat did not shut the body down directly. It demanded more of the circulation than the circulation could give, and the two things are, in the end, the same thing. Scientists have a precise pair of words for the two sides of this line, and they are worth knowing because they cut through so much confusion. They talk about compensable heat and uncompensable heat. Compensable heat is any heat your body can keep up with, where your cooling systems, working hard, can still match the heat load and hold your core temperature steady. You can be deeply uncomfortable, drenched in sweat, exhausted, and still be in compensable conditions because the system is coping, even if barely. Uncompensable heat is what lies on the other side of the line, the conditions where no amount of sweating and no amount of blood flow can keep pace, where your core temperature has no choice but to climb. The wet bulb ceiling is the name for the exact border between those two worlds, and the reason the empirical limit near 31 degrees matters more than the theoretical 35 is that it marks where real bodies, not idealized ones, cross from compensable into uncompensable, from a fight they can win into a fight that is already lost. There is one more cruelty hidden in the numbers, and it is the reason heat waves are so quietly effective at killing. The people most likely to cross into uncompensable conditions are also the people least likely to recognize it or escape it. An older adult living alone may not feel thirst strongly, may not perceive how hot the room has become, may be reluctant to open a window out of fear or to run an air conditioner out of worry about the bill. Their body is already working with a smaller safety margin, and their circumstances often remove the very tools that could save them. This is why heat waves do not kill randomly. They find the exact intersection of a weakened body and an unprotected life, and they concentrate their damage there, in apartments and back bedrooms, out of sight, which is part of why the death tolls are so often counted only afterward, in the grim reconciliation of how many more people died that week than should have. So hold the whole picture in your mind now, because we are about to leave the safety of the present. There is a hard ceiling on human heat tolerance. It is lower than the famous number, closer to 31 degrees on the wet bulb scale for the healthy, and lower still for the vulnerable. It has been, for all of human history, a limit so far away that it was purely theoretical, a cliff on the far side of a very large field. And the warming of the atmosphere is loading both the heat and the moisture that push the world toward it, walking us across that field a little further every year. Everything I have said so far you could still file under warning, under something that might happen someday, if trends continue. But that is where I have to stop being gentle with you, because the most unsettling discovery in this entire field is not about the future at all. It is that somewhere on Earth, in the last several years, in a few specific places, on a few specific days, a wet bulb thermometer has already read 35 degrees Celsius. The ceiling that was supposed to be theoretical, the one that was not meant to be reached until the end of the century, if ever, has already been touched. And I am going to show you exactly where. Part 4. The line the planet already crossed. For a long time, the scientific consensus was comforting in its way. The model suggested that wet bulb temperatures of 35 degrees Celsius, the theoretical ceiling of human survival, would not begin to appear anywhere on Earth until the second half of this century, and even then only in the very worst locations under the very worst warming. It was a future problem, a warning about a world our grandchildren might inherit. And then, in 2020, a team of researchers led by a scientist named Colin Raymond decided to check that assumption against reality. Instead of running a model forward into the future, they went backward through the records. They gathered decades of data from thousands of weather stations around the world, and instead of looking at daily averages, which smooth away the extremes, they went hunting for the brief, sharp, hourly spikes, the worst single moments each station had ever recorded. They wanted to know whether the ceiling was really still in the future, and what they found rewrote the timeline. The 35-degree wet bulb ceiling had already been reached. Not once, not as a fluke, but dozens of times at real weather stations in the real world in the years leading up to their study. The readings were brief, often lasting only an hour or two before conditions eased, and they were intensely local, confined to small pockets rather than spread across whole regions. But they were real. The supposed limit of human survivability, the number that was not meant to arrive until the end of the century, had been quietly touched already, and almost no one had noticed because it happened in flashes, in specific places, and then it passed. and the places tell you everything. The most frequent offenders, the spots where the wet bulb thermometer had already kissed that lethal ceiling, clustered around the shores of the Persian Gulf. Stations near the Saudi Arabian coast, at places like Dhahran and Daman, and near the coast of the United Arab Emirates had recorded these extreme readings. This is not a coincidence, and understanding why it is the Persian Gulf is the key to understanding the entire map of where this danger lives. The Persian Gulf is a shallow, nearly enclosed body of water sitting in one of the hottest regions on the planet. Its waters bake under a relentless sun until the sea itself becomes warm as a bath, and that warm sea evaporates constantly, pumping enormous quantities of moisture into the air just above it. So you get the two deadly ingredients delivered together in the same place at maximum strength: ferocious desert heat and a coastline manufacturing humidity around the clock. The air over the Gulf Coast on the worst summer days is both scorching and saturated, and that is the exact recipe that drives the wet bulb temperature toward its ceiling. The Raymond study found something else that should end any comfort that this is a rare freak occurrence. When they looked at the trend over time, they found that the frequency of these extreme humid heat events, the number of times stations around the world crossed dangerous wet bulb thresholds, had roughly doubled since 1979. Doubled in about 40 years. That is not a stable background that occasionally throws off a strange reading. That is a line moving in one direction and moving quickly. The rare event is becoming less rare, exactly as the 7% more moisture per degree physics predicts it should. The cliff at the edge of the field is no longer something we're only walking toward. In a few places, on a few days, we have already reached the edge and looked over it. Now keep that pattern in mind, because the Persian Gulf is only the first location on a map that gets much larger and much more populated. The Gulf Coast is dangerous, but it is not densely inhabited in the way that some other at-risk regions are. When scientists take the physics that makes the Gulf so lethal and ask where else on Earth those same ingredients come together, the answer lands on some of the most crowded places human beings have ever built. And at the top of that list is South Asia, specifically the great river valleys of the Indus and the Ganges, the belt that runs through Pakistan, across northern India and into Bangladesh. This is home to something like a fifth of all the people alive. It is one of the most densely populated regions on the entire planet, and a study published in 2017 identified it as being among the most vulnerable places on Earth to deadly humid heat before the century is out. And here the story takes a genuinely cruel turn, one that reveals how tangled this problem is with the way people actually live. You might assume the deadliest heat would build over the driest ground. But in these river valleys, the danger is amplified by the very thing that keeps 1.5 billion people fed. It is amplified by irrigation. Across the Indus and Ganges plains, farmers flood their fields to grow rice and wheat, spreading water across the land on a colossal scale. And all that water does exactly what the warm Persian Gulf does. It evaporates. It saturates the air above the fields with moisture, pushing the humidity up, and when a punishing pre-monsoon heat wave rolls across that same terrain, the heat and the sky-high humidity combine into precisely the wet bulb conditions that the human body cannot survive. The irrigation that sustains life in that region also, on the worst days, helps manufacture the air that could end it. The people are trapped between the heat and the water they depend on, and there is no simple way to choose one without losing the other. The same grim logic points to a third region, one that rarely comes up in these conversations in the West, but that may be the most consequential of all. Researchers studying the North China Plain, the flat, fertile, intensively farmed heartland that feeds much of China and holds something like 400 million people, concluded that it could become one of the deadliest places on Earth for humid heat in the latter half of this century. And the reason is the same reason as South Asia: intense agriculture, heavy irrigation, flat terrain that traps the air, and a warming climate stacking the heat higher every decade. 400 million people in one of the great agricultural engines of the world, living in a place that the science says is on a path towards summers that flirt with the limit of human survival. That is not a small or distant population. That is more than the entire population of the United States concentrated in a single vulnerable plain. I want to pull us back to the thread here, because it would be easy to let this become a tour of faraway places that feel like someone else's problem. It is not someone else's problem, and here is why. The physics that makes the Persian Gulf and the Ganges and the North China Plain dangerous is not foreign physics. It is the same wet bulb ceiling that hangs over the heat wave outside your window today. The difference between those regions and the United States is not that they are subject to different rules. It is only that they reach the shared ceiling first, because their geography stacks the ingredients highest. They are the early warning system for the rest of the planet. When you see that the Gulf has already touched 35 degrees on the wet bulb scale, and that the frequency of these events has doubled in 40 years, you're not looking at an exotic curiosity. You're looking at the leading edge of the same trend that produced the record warm nights over the mid-Atlantic this week. The map simply shows you who gets there first, and roughly in what order, as the whole world walks the same direction across the same field toward the same cliff. To understand why the Persian Gulf sits at the very front of this line, it helps to picture the specific machine that region has become. The Gulf is shallow and nearly enclosed, almost a giant warm lagoon, and through the long summer its waters heat until the surface can reach the mid-30s Celsius, warm as a heated swimming pool, across an enormous area. A warm sea like that evaporates ferociously, loading the air just above it with moisture, hour after hour, day after day. Meanwhile, the surrounding land bakes under some of the most intense sunshine on the planet. So when a sea breeze carries that saturated air on shore and mixes it with the desert heat, you get the two lethal ingredients delivered together at full strength, and the wet bulb temperature spikes. The readings that briefly touched the ceiling did not come from the open desert. They came from the coast, from the narrow strip where the hot land and the hot wet sea meet. Geography built a wet bulb factory there, and a warming world is simply turning up its output. South Asia runs on a different but equally deadly schedule, and it has already delivered warnings written in bodies, not just numbers. Before the summer monsoon arrives to break the heat, the Indus and Ganges plains go through a pre-monsoon season of building, stagnant, humid heat, and it has repeatedly turned lethal. In recent history, single pre-monsoon heat, waves across India and Pakistan, have killed thousands of people in a matter of weeks, overwhelming hospitals, melting road surfaces, and filling morgues past capacity. And those events, as horrifying as they were, did not reach the theoretical ceiling either. They killed thousands while sitting below the wet bulb limit because of exactly the vulnerability we discussed, the old and the poor and the outdoor labourers who cannot simply stop working when the air turns dangerous. Now layer onto that the fact that the region keeps warming and the fields keep pumping moisture into the air through irrigation, and you can see why the researchers singled it out. It is not that South Asia will suddenly cross a line it has never approached. It is that a place already killing thousands in the shadow of the ceiling is being pushed, year by year, closer to the ceiling itself. And this is the thread I do not want you to lose as the map fills in. Every one of these places, the Gulf, the Ganges, the North China Plain, is not special in its physics. It is only special in its geography, in the way it happens to stack the heat and the moisture higher and sooner than everywhere else. The ceiling that hangs over them is the identical ceiling that hangs over the mid-Atlantic today, over the whole warming world, the same measurement, the same limit of the same human body. What the map really shows is not a set of faraway problems. It shows the order of arrival. It shows who reaches the shared destination first, and by watching them, we are watching a preview of the road every warming region is travelling, just at different speeds. The people on that coast and in those valleys are not a different story from ours. They are the opening chapter of the same one. Look at the specific cities sitting in the crosshairs, because the abstraction of a vulnerable region becomes much sharper when you name the places. Along the Indus and the Ganges and their crowded deltas sit some of the largest urban populations on Earth. Karachi in Pakistan holds well over 10 million people, and a single humid heatwave there in recent years killed well over 1,000 of them in a matter of days. Kolkata, in eastern India, and Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, are each home to many millions more, packed into low-lying, humid, near-coastal terrain where the wet bulb temperature climbs highest. These are not remote outposts. They're among the great cities of the 21st century, growing fast, and they sit squarely in the zone the research flags as the most dangerous on the planet for humid heat. When a study says a fifth of humanity lives in the most exposed region, this is what that fifth looks like. Not empty countryside, but some of the densest concentrations of human beings anywhere. And the danger falls hardest on the people least able to escape it, which in these cities means the enormous workforce that labours outdoors. The rickshaw pullers, the street vendors, the construction crews, the brickmakers standing over kilns, the farm labourers in the surrounding fields all work through the heat, because stopping means not eating. They cannot retreat into cooled rooms, because they have no cooled rooms and no choice but to keep moving. So when the wet bulb temperature climbs toward the ceiling in a place like this, it does not find a population that can shelter and wait. It finds tens of millions of people already pushed to their physical limits by the work that keeps them alive, and it presses down on exactly the ones with the least margin left. That is the human shape of the map, and it is the same pattern we keep finding at every scale of this story, from a single elderly neighbour to a coastline of crowded cities. The heat does not strike evenly. It seeks out the vulnerable, and it always has. And that word, order, is the hinge to where we go next. Because so far I have been describing a ceiling and pointing to the places that reach it soonest. But the more important and more frightening question is not where the line gets crossed first. It is how much of the inhabited Earth ends up on the wrong side of livable conditions as this century unfolds, and how many human beings that actually means. It turns out that a group of scientists asked exactly that question, and they came at it from an angle that has nothing to do with a single deadly afternoon. They asked something quieter, and, in a way, even more sweeping. They asked where, on the surface of this planet, human beings have actually been able to live and thrive for the last several thousand years, and what happens to that zone, that narrow, comfortable band we have always occupied, as the temperature climbs. The answer they found describes a shift so large that it is measured not in degrees but in billions of people, and that is the number I have been building toward. Part 5. The Narrow Band. We never noticed. We lived in. In 2020, a group of researchers working across ecology and climate science published a study with a quietly staggering premise. They pointed out something so obvious that almost no one had ever bothered to measure it directly. For thousands of years, human beings, despite spreading across nearly every landmass on Earth, despite our technology and our adaptability, have actually clustered within a surprisingly narrow band of climate. When they mapped where people have concentrated, not just today but going back 6,000 years, they found that the overwhelming majority of humanity has always lived in places with a mean annual temperature centered around a comfortable range, roughly 11 to 15 degrees Celsius. Think of the great cradles of civilization, the mild temperate zones, the places where agriculture flourished and cities grew. There is a temperature signature to human flourishing, and it has been remarkably, almost stubbornly stable across the entire span of recorded history. They called this band the human climate niche. Every animal has a niche, a set of conditions it is suited to, a range of temperature and moisture and habitat where it can thrive, and outside of which it struggles. We do not usually think of ourselves as having one because we build houses and grow crops and heat, and cool our buildings and generally act as though we have escaped the constraints that bind other creatures. But the data says otherwise. The data says that for all our cleverness, we have mostly stayed inside a narrow thermal comfort zone, the same one for 6,000 years, through the rise and fall of every empire, through every technological revolution. We did not conquer the temperature band, we settled it, and we stayed. Now here is what the researchers did next, and it is the part that turns a curiosity into an alarm. They took that stable niche, that band where humans have always lived, and they projected it forward under continued warming. They asked a simple question. If the planet keeps heating on a high emissions path, where does that comfortable band go? Because the band itself does not disappear. It moves. The zone of 11 to 15 degree mean annual temperature shifts across the map, toward the poles, up mountainsides, away from the equator. And the land that people currently occupy, the places where cities and farms and populations already sit, gets left behind as the climate slides out from under it. So the question becomes, how many people end up living outside the niche that has defined human habitation for all of history? The answer they arrived at is one of those numbers that is hard to hold in your head. Under a high-emission scenario, by the year 2070, 1 to 3 billion people could be living outside the climate niche that has supported human societies for the past 6,000 years. Not displaced necessarily, not all at once, not in a single dramatic event, but living in conditions hotter than the band our species has always chosen when it had the choice. To put a finer point on it, the study looked at the fraction of Earth's land surface that experiences a truly punishing mean annual temperature above 29 degrees Celsius, the kind of sustained heat that today is found almost nowhere that people live. Right now, that blistering condition covers only about 0.8% of the planet's land, and it is concentrated in the most brutal core of the Sahara Desert, essentially uninhabited. Under high warming, by 2070, that same punishing condition could spread to cover nearly 19% of the planet's land surface. Sit with the size of that jump, from less than 1% of the land to nearly 1/5 of it, carrying conditions that today exist only in the dead core of the largest hot desert on Earth. And these are not empty lands. The regions that slide into that category are, disproportionately, the places where enormous numbers of people already live, across South Asia, across sub-Saharan Africa, across the Middle East, across parts of Central and South America. The climate that today belongs to the emptiest, most hostile desert on the planet expands outward until it overlaps with the homes of billions. The niche does not vanish. It relocates, and it does not take the people with it. And I want to connect this carefully back to the ceiling, because these are two different faces of the same threat, and it matters that you see how they fit together. The wet bulb limit we spent the first half of this discussing is the acute danger, the single deadly afternoon, the sharp edge where a specific combination of heat and humidity kills a person within hours. The human climate niche is the chronic danger, the slow, grinding, year-round shift in where human life is comfortable and sustainable at all. One is a knife, the other is a tide. The knife takes individuals in hours, the tide moves whole populations over decades, and the terrifying thing is that they are driven by the same underlying warming, and they arrive in the same places and they reinforce each other. The regions crossing toward the wet bulb ceiling are largely the same regions sliding out of the human niche. The people facing the deadliest single days are largely the same people facing the slow loss of livable conditions all year round. It is not two problems, it is one problem showing you two of its faces. You might reasonably ask at this point, what about air conditioning? Is that not exactly the tool that lets us escape our niche? The invention that already lets people live comfortably in Phoenix and Dubai and Singapore, places well outside the ancestral comfort band. And it is a fair question, and the honest answer is that air conditioning is real protection. But it is a deeply unequal and fragile kind of protection, and leaning on it too hard is its own trap. Air conditioning requires two things that cannot be assumed. It requires that you can afford it, and it requires that the power stays on. In the wealthiest parts of the world, that combination mostly holds. But across much of the region we just discussed, the great vulnerable belt of South Asia and Africa, hundreds of millions of people cannot afford reliable cooling, and the electrical grids are not robust enough to guarantee power through the very heat waves when demand spikes highest. And that is the cruelest part of relying on cooling, because the moment of greatest danger, the peak of a deadly heat wave, is exactly the moment when demand surges and grids are most likely to fail. The protection is weakest precisely when it is needed most. We saw a small preview of that logic in the current heatwave, when the New York Weather Office warned about strain on the electrical system, about the demand that extreme heat places on the grid at the same time everyone reaches for the same switch. There is a deeper irony buried in the cooling itself, and it is worth naming even briefly. Air conditioning works by taking the heat from inside a building and dumping it outside into the air of the city. Multiply that across millions of units in a dense metropolis, and the machines cooling the insides of buildings are measurably warming the air of the streets, making the outdoor heat worse for everyone not inside, and for everyone the moment they step out. And the energy that runs all of it, unless it comes from clean sources, feeds back into the very warming that is driving the whole problem. Cooling is a shield, but it is a shield that, held up by the whole civilization at once, can make the storm outside it a little stronger. None of this means air conditioning is a mistake. It saves lives, enormous numbers of them. It only means that it is not the escape hatch from the niche that we sometimes imagine, and that a future built on the assumption that everyone can simply cool their way out is a future built on a foundation that the poorest and most exposed people do not have. It is worth being clear about what living outside the niche actually means, because it is not as simple as a place becoming a furnace overnight. A region sliding out of the human climate band does not necessarily become instantly deadly. What it loses first is the easy abundance that made it a good place to build a life. Crops that thrive for generations begin to fail more often in the heat. Livestock struggle. Outdoor labour, the farming and construction and delivery that hold a society together, becomes dangerous for more hours of more days, until whole categories of work can only be done at night or not at all. Water grows scarcer as heat drives up evaporation and demand at once. None of that is a single dramatic death. It is a slow erosion of the conditions that let large numbers of people live in a place comfortably, and it is exactly the kind of pressure that across history has set human populations in motion. That is the quiet link between the wet bulb ceiling and the shape of the human future, and it deserves to be said plainly. When a place becomes harder to live in, people do what people have always done. They move. They move from the countryside to the cities, from the hotter regions toward the cooler ones, from the places sliding out of the niche toward the places still inside it. The projection that 1 to 3 billion people could be living outside the historical climate band by 2070 is not, by itself, a prediction of that many deaths. It is a description of that much pressure, that much strain on where and how people can live, building over the coming decades. And pressure like that does not stay contained. It reshapes economies, borders, and politics far from the places where the heat is worst, which is one more reason this is not a distant story for anyone. A ceiling reached on a coastline in one part of the world sends its consequences everywhere, carried not by the heat itself but by the human response to it. And still, underneath the slow tide of the shifting niche, the sharp knife of the wet bulb ceiling waits for the worst days, and the two work together in a way that makes each more dangerous. A region growing steadily hotter and less livable is also a region edging closer to the acute limit, so that the same population feeling the chronic strain of a shifting climate is the population most exposed when a single extreme humid heat wave arrives and pushes the wet bulb temperature toward the ceiling. The tide weakens the defences, and then, on the worst day, the knife arrives. That is the full shape of the threat, and it is why neither the acute nor the chronic version can be understood alone. They are two expressions of the same warming, aimed at the same places at the same people, and the ancient past is about to show us that this combination, heat as both a slow tide and a sudden wall, is precisely what the planet is capable of when it truly turns up the temperature. So here is where we stand at the midpoint of this story. There is a hard ceiling on human survival. It is lower than we thought. It has already been briefly touched in a few places, and the warming that pushes the world toward it is also dragging the entire comfortable band of human habitation away from where billions of people actually live. That is the present and the near future, the world of this century, the world of the child born today, and if that were the whole story, it would be enough. But I promised you at the start that we would go further back than this century, much further, because there is a question underneath all of this that the models and the projections cannot fully answer on their own. The question is whether heat, past a certain point, can do more than kill individuals and displace populations. The question is whether it can empty an entire region of complex life altogether. And to answer that, we cannot look forward, because it has not happened to us yet. We have to look backward, into the long memory of the planet itself, to the times when the Earth ran this exact experiment at full scale and recorded the results in stone. Part 6. The last time the world ran this hot. About 56 million years ago, long after the dinosaurs were gone but long before anything resembling a human walked the Earth, the planet ran a fever. Geologists have a name for it, a mouthful of a name, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, but you can just think of it as the last time the world got suddenly enormously hot and left a clear enough record for us to read. Something, and scientists still argue about exactly what, released a colossal surge of carbon into the atmosphere and the oceans over a relatively short geological window, and the planet responded the way physics says it must. The global average temperature climbed by roughly 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. The whole Earth, warmer by that much, on average, everywhere, for tens of thousands of years. I'm bringing you to this ancient event for a specific reason, and I want to be honest about why, because the connection to our own moment is both real and imperfect, and you deserve the honest version. The reason the Paleocene-Eocene warming matters is that it is the closest thing in the entire geological record to what we're doing right now. It was a warming driven by a massive release of carbon, which is exactly the mechanism behind the modern warming that is pushing the world toward the wet bulb ceiling we have been discussing. So it is a natural experiment, a chance to see what a carbon-driven heat surge actually does to a living planet, played out to completion with the results preserved in the rock. When we ask where today's heat is ultimately taking us, this ancient fever is one of the few places nature has already written down an answer. And the answer, in the oceans first, was harsh. When you pump that much carbon into the air, a large fraction of it dissolves into the sea, and there it turns the water more acidic. During this ancient warming, the abyssal oceans acidified enough that it dissolved the chalky shells and sediments on the sea floor, leaving a telltale rusty layer that geologists can still put their fingers on, in cores drilled from the ocean bottom. Whole communities of tiny seafloor organisms, the foraminifera that had lived quietly in the abyss for ages, went extinct in that interval. The warming did not just heat the water, it changed its chemistry, and the life that could not tolerate the new chemistry vanished. This is a pattern worth holding on to because it tells you that a carbon-driven heat event does not attack life along a single front. It comes at the living world through temperature and through the chemistry of the sea at the same time. On land, the story took a stranger and, in a way, more poignant turn, and it connects directly back to the theme of bodies and heat that runs through this entire video. As the world warmed, animals did two things. First, they moved. Plants and animals that were adapted to cooler conditions migrated toward the poles and up the mountains, chasing the climate band they were built for as it slid away from the equator. Exactly the kind of movement we just described for the modern human niche, except performed by the whole living world at once. The forest marched north. The creatures followed. The map of life redrew itself to track the shifting temperature. But it was the second thing that is truly haunting, because it shows evolution reaching for the same solution to heat that our own physiology depends on. During the hottest stretch of that ancient warming, many mammal species got smaller, their bodies shrank. Scientists have traced this in the fossil record of early mammals, including the ancestors of horses, which during this warm interval evolved down to a strikingly small size, some of them no bigger than a small dog or even a house cat. And then, as the planet slowly cooled again over the following tens of thousands of years, those same lineages grew back to larger sizes. The dwarfing tracked the heat, down and then back up like a needle on a dial. Why would heat make animals shrink? The leading explanation goes right back to the physics we started this whole story with. A smaller body has more surface area relative to its mass, and more surface area means a better ratio for shedding heat. In a hotter world, being small is a cooling strategy. Evolution, given tens of thousands of years to work, literally reshaped the bodies of mammals to run cooler. It is the same problem your sweat is solving on this hot 4th of July. The problem of a warm-blooded animal trying to dump heat into a hostile environment, solved on the scale of whole species over geological time. Now, I promised you honesty, so here is the crucial caveat. The place where the ancient warming and our own diverge, and it cuts in a direction that should not comfort you. That ancient carbon release, as massive as it was, unfolded over thousands of years. It was by the standards of the modern world slow. Life had time. The forests had time to migrate north. The mammals had time to evolve smaller and then larger again. The whole living system had room to shuffle and adapt because the change, though enormous, was spread across a span longer than all of human civilization many times over. And that is the terrible difference. The carbon that ancient event released over thousands of years, our civilization is releasing in a window of a couple of centuries. We are running the same experiment, with the same basic chemistry and the same basic physics, but we are running it hundreds of times faster. And speed is the one thing that living systems cannot easily survive, because adaptation, whether it is a forest migrating or a species evolving smaller, takes time, and time is exactly what a fast warming does not give. So when people point to the ancient past and say the Earth has been warmer before, life survived, the planet is fine, they are telling you something that is technically true and deeply misleading. Yes, life survived the ancient fever, but it survived it by moving and by changing over spans of time so long that the pace of change per human lifetime was almost nothing. What we're doing is compressing that same magnitude of change into a period so short that a single person can watch it happen from childhood to old age. The lesson of that ancient warming is not that heat is harmless because life pulled through. The lesson is that even a slow carbon fever reorganized the entire living world, drove extinctions in the sea, and physically reshaped the bodies of mammals on land, and it did all of that with the luxury of time that we are not giving ourselves. Bring it back to the ceiling, and the point sharpens further. The ancient world reorganized, but it did not, as far as we can tell, push large regions past the absolute limit where complex animal life simply cannot exist. It got hot, and life adapted and moved. It was a fever, and the patient recovered, changed but alive. The scale of that ancient carbon release is worth sitting with, because it is the closest natural mirror we have to what industrial civilization is doing. Scientists estimate that the amount of carbon injected into the atmosphere and oceans during that ancient fever was enormous, comparable in total to what human beings would release if we burned through a large fraction of the planet's remaining fossil fuels. In other words, nature ran an experiment roughly the size of the one we're running, and the planet took something like 150,000 years to fully absorb that carbon and settle back to its earlier state. 150,000 years. That is the recovery time for a carbon fever of that magnitude, far longer than the entire span of human civilization, far longer than our species has even existed in its modern form. When people say the Earth will be fine, that it has recovered from worse, this is the timescale they are quietly invoking. The planet does recover. It simply does so on a clock that has nothing to do with human lives, human societies, or human patience. The dwarfing of the mammals deserves a second look too, because it is more than a strange fossil curiosity. It is direct physical evidence that heat imposes hard limits on the bodies of warm-blooded animals, the same limits we have been circling this entire time. When those early mammal lineages evolved smaller during the hottest interval and then grew back larger as it cooled, they were responding to the same fundamental problem your body is solving on this hot holiday. The problem of shedding metabolic heat into an environment that does not want to accept it. A smaller body sheds heat more easily. Evolution, given tens of thousands of years, found that solution and applied it across whole species. But notice what that tells us about speed. That adaptation required tens of thousands of years of gradual change to unfold. It is the kind of solution that only works when the warming is slow enough for bodies to evolve alongside it. A warming compressed into a century or two gives no species time to shrink, to migrate, to adjust its very anatomy. The ancient world adapted because it had time. That is the luxury we are removing from the equation. So the honest takeaway from that ancient fever is a double-edged one, and I want you to hold both edges. On one side, it is genuinely reassuring that a carbon release of that size did not end life on Earth, that the planet warmed enormously and recovered, that the living world proved resilient across the long arc of geological time. On the other side, it reorganized the entire biosphere, drove extinctions in the sea, physically reshaped the animals of the land, and took 150,000 years to undo. And it did all of that while unfolding slowly enough for life to keep pace. We are reproducing the cause while stripping away the one mercy the ancient event had, which was time. And even that ancient fever, for all its violence, never quite pushed the planet past the ultimate line, the line where heat alone empties a region of complex life entirely. For that, we have to go to the one event that did, the event that stands at the top of the staircase, and it is a place far darker than anything the mammals of the warm Eocene ever knew. What did that ancient carbon actually come from? Scientists still argue about the exact trigger, and the argument matters, because it is really an argument about how sensitive the planet is to a push. The leading suspects include enormous volcanic activity in the North Atlantic as the continents pulled apart, and the sudden release of frozen methane, a powerful heat-trapping gas, from the sea floor as the oceans warmed. That second possibility is the unsettling one, because it describes a feedback loop, warming that releases a gas that causes more warming, the planet amplifying its own fever once something gives it a shove. Whatever lit the match, the result was a world transformed. The poles, which today wear ice, were warm enough that crocodile relatives and palm-like plants lived in the far north, and the tropics grew so hot that some researchers suspect parts of them brushed the edge of what complex life could tolerate. A faint early rhyme of the deadlier event we're about to examine. Scientists have a name for these episodes now, these sharp spikes of global heat driven by carbon, and they call them hyperthermals. The ancient fever we have been discussing is the largest and best studied one, but it was not the only one. The rock record holds several of these carbon-driven heat spikes, each a natural experiment in what happens when you load the atmosphere with heat-trapping gas quickly, and each leaving the same fingerprints, warming, ocean acidification, and life on the move. They are, in a real sense, the closest things in the planet's memory to the experiment we are running right now, and the reason scientists study them so intently is not idle curiosity. It is that these ancient spikes are the only direct evidence we have of how the whole Earth system answers when the carbon goes up fast, and every one of them tells the same basic story. The planet warms, the chemistry shifts, and life survives only by moving, changing, and enduring across spans of time we are not giving ourselves. Which brings us to the hard limit of that survival, the one place where even moving was not enough. But that is because the Paleocene-Eocene warming, for all its scale, was not the worst the Earth has ever done. It was not even close. There was another time, far older and far more violent, when the planet did not just run a fever. It came close to dying. A time when the heat, in the worst affected zones, did cross the line we have been circling this entire video, the line past which complex life cannot hold on, and emptied whole regions of the planet of nearly everything that lived there. It is the closest the Earth has ever come to sterilizing itself, and the fingerprints of heat are all over the crime scene. If the ancient fever shows you what warming does when life still has somewhere to go, this next event shows you what happens when the heat itself becomes the wall. And it is where the phrase "too hot for life" stops being a warning about the future and becomes a description of something that has already once actually happened. Part 7. The day the equator went silent. About 252 million years ago, life on Earth very nearly ended. Not a portion of it, not a single unlucky group like the dinosaurs would lose much later, but very nearly all of it. Scientists call this event the end-Permian extinction. Though it has earned a blunter nickname that tells you everything you need to know, they call it the Great Dying. It is the largest mass extinction in the entire history of the planet, worse than the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, worse than anything before or since. In the oceans, an estimated 90% or more of all species were wiped out. On land, the majority of species vanished as well. Coral reefs disappeared for millions of years. Forests collapsed. The intricate web of life that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build was torn down to a few surviving threads, and the planet spent the next several million years slowly, painfully rebuilding from the wreckage. What did it? The trigger, as best the evidence can tell us, was volcanism on a scale that is almost impossible to picture. In what is now Siberia, the Earth's crust cracked open and poured out floods of lava across an area the size of a continent. Not in a single eruption, but in a drawn-out convulsion that lasted a very long time. And those eruptions did something more dangerous than the lava itself. They released staggering quantities of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, and you already know from everything we have discussed today what a massive release of carbon does. It warms the planet. The end-Permian was, at its core, a carbon-driven heating event. The same fundamental mechanism as the ancient fever we just examined, and the same fundamental mechanism as the modern warming pushing our world toward the wet bulb ceiling. Except this time the release was so immense, and the warming so extreme, that it drove the Earth into a state that the gentler ancient fever never reached. The warming was brutal, and it did not act alone. As the oceans heated, they lost their ability to hold dissolved oxygen, because warm water holds less oxygen than cold water, and enormous stretches of the sea became oxygen-starved dead zones where almost nothing could breathe. The water grew warm, acidic, and suffocating all at once. A triple assault, and the life of the oceans was gutted. But it is what the heat did on land, and in the shallow seas of the tropics, that connects most directly to the thread of this entire video, because this is the moment the Earth crossed the line we have been talking about the whole time. In 2012, a team of scientists led by a researcher named Yadong Sun published a reconstruction of the temperatures during and after the Great Dying, built from chemical signatures locked inside the fossilized remains of tiny marine organisms. And what they found was heat almost beyond belief. They estimated that sea surface temperatures in the tropics climbed to around 38 to 40 degrees Celsius. For comparison, most ocean life today is stressed when tropical seas push much past 30. And on land, near the equator, their reconstruction implied surface temperatures that soared well beyond 40 degrees Celsius into a range that complex, active, warm-blooded or even cold-blooded animals simply cannot function in for long. The tropics, which today are the most biologically abundant places on the entire planet, the rainforests and coral reefs bursting with more life than anywhere else, became, during the Great Dying, something the scientists described in a way that should send a chill through you despite the heat. They became a dead zone, an equatorial dead zone. Let me be precise about what that means, because it is the hinge of this entire episode and the reason I brought you 252 million years into the past. The researchers found evidence that the middle of the planet, the belt around the equator, got so hot that complex life could not survive there at all. Fish and other animals appear to have largely fled the tropics, their fossils vanishing from equatorial rocks and appearing instead at higher latitudes, closer to the poles, where the heat was merely terrible instead of lethal. Even plants struggled in the equatorial zone. The most life-friendly region on Earth was rendered, by heat alone, into a place where the metabolisms of complex organisms could not keep functioning, where staying meant dying, where the only options were to flee toward the poles or to perish. This is not a projection. This is not a model of some possible future. This is the geological record telling us that there is in fact a temperature past which a region of this planet becomes too hot for complex life to hold on, and that the Earth has crossed that temperature before, and that when it did, the richest zone on the planet fell silent. Now I need to hold the two halves of this together for you, the ancient past and the human present, because the point is not to suggest that we are about to recreate the Great Dying. We are not, and I will not tell you that we are, because it would not be honest. The end Permian was driven by volcanic carbon release on a scale that vastly exceeds anything human civilization is capable of, and it unfolded over a very long time, and its most extreme heat went far beyond what even the worst human warming scenarios project for this century. So please hear this clearly. I'm not saying we are heading for 90% extinction, or an equatorial dead zone, or the end of complex life. That is not the lesson, and anyone who tells you it is selling fear rather than truth. Here is the actual lesson, and it is quieter and more precise, and, I think, more genuinely unsettling than any doomsday claim. The Great Dying proves that the ceiling is real. It proves that too hot for life is not a figure of speech, not a rhetorical flourish, but an actual physical condition that the Earth can produce and has produced, a state in which heat alone empties a region of complex organisms. Everything we discussed in the first half of this video, the wet bulb limit, the 6-hour death, the doubling of extreme events, the shrinking human niche, all of it is describing the lower rungs of a ladder whose top rung the planet has already stood on. We are not talking about a made-up danger. We're talking about the bottom of a staircase whose summit is written in stone in the rock record of the worst day the living world ever had. The question is never whether the ceiling exists. The Permian settled that. The only question is how far up that staircase a fast, human-driven warming carries us, and how many people live in the regions that reach the dangerous steps first. It is worth understanding just how the heat did its killing during the Great Dying, because it did not work alone, and the way the pieces combined is a warning about how these catastrophes actually unfold. The warming and the ocean changes reinforced each other in a vicious loop. As the seas heated, they held less oxygen, so enormous underwater regions suffocated. In those oxygen-starved waters, certain bacteria thrived that produce hydrogen sulfide, the poisonous gas that smells of rotten eggs, and some scientists think that gas built up in the oceans and even bled into the atmosphere, adding a chemical assault on top of the heat and the suffocation. So life at the end of the Permian was not facing a single problem. It was facing heat, acidification, oxygen loss and possibly poisoning all at once, all driven by the same underlying surge of volcanic carbon. That is the signature of the worst catastrophes in Earth's history. They are rarely one thing. They are cascades, where the first push knocks over a row of dominoes that each make the others worse, until the damage far exceeds what any single cause could have done alone. The recovery from that catastrophe tells you something about the depth of the wound. After most disruptions, life bounces back within a geological blink. After the Great Dying, the recovery took something on the order of several million years. For a long stretch afterward, the fossil record shows a strange, impoverished world, dominated by a few hardy survivor species spread thinly across the globe, the ecological equivalent of weeds colonizing a burned field. It took millions of years for the richness of life, the complex food webs and the variety of forms to rebuild to anything like what came before. When a heat catastrophe reaches all the way to the top of the staircase, it does not just kill a generation or a century's worth of life. It sets the entire living world back by a span of time that makes human history look like a single afternoon. Now let me be scrupulously fair once more, because the honest framing is what makes this land instead of collapsing into hysteria. Nothing about our situation is on track to recreate the end Permian. The volcanic carbon release that drove it dwarfs anything human civilization can produce. Its warming went far beyond even the grimmest projections for our century, and the extra ingredients, the scale of the ocean poisoning, are not on our menu. I am not telling you the great dying is coming back. What I'm telling you is narrower and I think more genuinely sobering. The end Permian is the hard proof, written in stone, that the phrase too hot for life describes a real physical state this planet can enter, that heat past a threshold can and did empty the richest regions of the Earth of complex life. It establishes beyond any argument that the ceiling at the top of the staircase is not imaginary. And once you know the top of the staircase is real, every step you take up it, however far from the summit, means something different than it did when you could tell yourself the staircase had no top at all. And that reframes everything, doesn't it? Because it means the heat wave outside your window today is not a disconnected event, not just an unpleasant holiday. It is one small early step on a staircase that the planet has climbed to the very top of once before. Most of the steps between where we are and where the Permian stood are steps no one is seriously suggesting we will take. But we are, undeniably, on the staircase, and we are, undeniably, climbing. And the science says we have already reached the steps where the human body's own ceiling comes into play in a few places on a few days. So the honest question, the one this whole video has been building toward, is not whether any of this is real. It is real. The question is what we do with the fact that it is real, and how we tell the difference between the parts of this that are genuine, measured, physical truth, and the parts that get exaggerated, distorted, and turned into something else entirely by people who profit from panic. Because there is a great deal of nonsense attached to this subject, and separating the real fear from the fake fear is the most important skill you can carry out of this video. So that is exactly what we are going to do next. Part 8. What this is and what it isn't. Whenever a heat wave like this one settles over the country, two very loud and very opposite voices start shouting, and both of them are lying to you, in different directions. One voice says there is nothing to see here, that summers have always been hot, that the records are faked, or the thermometers are rigged, or the whole thing is a hoax cooked up for someone's benefit. The other voice says the opposite, that this is the end, that the cities will be uninhabitable next year, that billions will die by some near date, that you should give up hope entirely. And the strange, frustrating truth is that both of those voices are wrong, and the real story sits in the uncomfortable middle where nobody is shouting because the middle does not get clicks. So let me walk you through the loudest false claims, one at a time, and show you exactly where each one breaks, because being able to tell the real fear from the fake fear is the whole game. Start with the most common one. It's just summer. It's always been hot. Your grandfather worked in the fields in the heat and he was fine, and there is a kernel of something real in that, because summers have always had heat waves, and human beings are genuinely tough. But the claim falls apart the moment you look at the actual measurements. Because scientists can now do something they could not do a couple of decades ago. They can take a specific heat wave and calculate how much more likely and how much more intense it became because of the warming trend. This field is called attribution science, and the teams that do it, running the same weather through thousands of simulations with and without the extra heat we have added, keep finding the same thing. Many recent heat waves were made several times more likely and several degrees hotter than they would have been in the climate your grandfather worked in. The heat he endured and the heat we are enduring are not the same heat. The dice have been weighted. This is not the same summer with a scary narrator. It is a measurably different summer, and the difference is quantified, not asserted. Then there is the more paranoid version. The records are faked. It's just the cities, the urban heat island, all that concrete and asphalt making the thermometers read high, and the scientists are covering it up. And again, there is a real phenomenon buried in there, because cities genuinely are hotter than the countryside around them. That part is true and well known. But the idea that it explains away global warming collapses under the simplest check, which is that we do not measure the planet's temperature with a few thermometers in city parking lots. We measure it with satellites looking down from orbit, with buoys floating across every ocean, with instruments over the empty middle of the sea and the empty middle of the Arctic where there is not a city for thousands of miles. And the warming shows up in all of them, over the oceans, over the ice, over the rural land, in complete agreement. The urban heat island effect is real, it is measured, and it is specifically corrected for in the records. You cannot explain a warming ocean with city pavement. There is no pavement in the middle of the Pacific. The next claim is more sophisticated, and it is the one that trips up thoughtful people. It's the sun. The sun drives the climate. The sun has cycles, and this is just the sun getting more active. And this one deserves respect, because the sun absolutely is the ultimate engine of Earth's climate, and solar activity does vary. But we watch the sun constantly. We measure its output precisely, and here is the problem for the theory. Over the recent decades in which the Earth has warmed the most, the sun's energy output has been flat, and if anything slightly declining. The sun has not been getting stronger while we cook, but there is an even cleaner fingerprint, and I love this one because it is so decisive. If the sun were driving the warming, you would expect the whole atmosphere to warm, top to bottom, because you would be turning up the heat source at the outside. Instead, what we actually observe is that the lower atmosphere, where we live, is warming, while the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere high above us, is cooling. That specific pattern, warm below and cool above, is not what a stronger sun produces. It is precisely what a thickening blanket of greenhouse gases produces, trapping heat down low and letting the heights above run cold. The sun would warm the whole column. What we see is a blanket, not a brighter fire. The fingerprint points one way, and then there is the wildest branch, the claim that this is all deliberate, that shadowy programs are engineering the heat, cooking specific regions on purpose with secret technology, steering the weather, manufacturing the domes. And I understand the pull of this idea because it offers something the truth does not: a villain, someone to blame, a hand on a lever. But the physics buries it instantly. The energy involved in a single one of these continental heat domes, the sheer quantity of joules required to hold that much air that hot for that many days, dwarfs the total output of every facility humans have ever built by many orders of magnitude. There is no machine, no secret array, no installation on Earth that produces energy on the scale of a weather system the size of a country. Weather is one of the most powerful things the planet does. The notion that it is being puppeteered by a hidden device gets the scale exactly backwards. We are not powerful enough to build these heat domes on purpose. We are only collectively and accidentally powerful enough to make them a little more likely and a little more intense by changing the composition of the whole atmosphere. That is a different and far less comforting kind of power, because it has no operator to arrest and no switch to flip off. So that is the wall of denial, brick by brick, and every brick crumbles under the data. But I promised you the other voice is lying too, and I meant it, because the catastrophist has become just as dishonest in the opposite direction, and you need to be armed against that one as well. When someone tells you that these cities will be literally uninhabitable next summer, that the wet bulb ceiling is about to sweep across the United States and kill millions this year, that there is no point in planning for a future because there will not be one, they are distorting the same science I have spent this whole video laying out. Here is the honest calibration. The 35-degree wet bulb ceiling remains today rare and brief and geographically tiny. Even the lower real-world limit near 31 degrees is reached only in the most extreme spots on the most extreme days. The heat wave over the mid-Atlantic right now, as dangerous as it genuinely is nowhere near that absolute ceiling. The near-term danger, the thing that is actually killing people this summer and every summer, is not the science fiction wall of instant death. It is the ordinary, grinding, unequal danger of heat pressing on the vulnerable, on the old and the sick and the poor and the unsheltered, in the space far below the ceiling. That is where the bodies actually are. Not at the theoretical limit, but in the long shadow beneath it. And keeping those two things separate is everything, because they call for completely different responses. The denial tells you to do nothing because there is no problem. The catastrophism tells you to do nothing because the problem is hopeless. Both of them conveniently end in doing nothing. The truth is the only one of the three that asks something of you, because the truth is that this is a real, measured, physical trend, that it is dangerous now to specific people in specific ways, and that its long-term direction is set by choices that are still actually being made. It is not a hoax, and it is not the apocalypse. It is a slope. We can see roughly where it leads, and how far down it we travel is not yet fixed. Since I have spent so long tearing down the false stories, let me spend a moment on what an honest response actually looks like. Because the truth, unlike the denial and the doom, points somewhere. At the level of a city, the tools are unglamorous and they genuinely work. Cooling centres, air-conditioned public buildings thrown open during the worst days, save lives, especially among the elderly and the isolated. Painting roofs white, or planting them green measurably lowers indoor temperatures and eases the urban heat that air conditioners themselves worsen. Planting trees along streets drops the temperature underneath them by several degrees, turning a lethal sidewalk into a merely uncomfortable one. Early warning systems that alert vulnerable people and the services that check on them, built after disasters like the one that struck Chicago, have measurably cut death tolls in the cities that adopted them. None of these are futuristic. They are the boring, effective, already proven work of adapting a society to heat it was not built for, and they are the difference between a heat wave that kills hundreds and one that kills a handful. At the level of the individual and the worker, the honest response is just as concrete. The people who die in heat waves are disproportionately those who cannot stop. The outdoor labourers, the construction crews, the farm workers bent over fields in the worst hours of the day, simple protections, mandated water and shade and rest breaks, shifting heavy work to the cooler hours, treating extreme heat as the genuine occupational hazard it is, save lives that are otherwise lost quietly and needlessly. And on the larger scale, the thing that actually sets where the whole staircase leads. The single lever that decides whether the dangerous zone stays confined to a few coastlines or spreads across a fifth of the planet's land is how much more carbon we add to the air in the decades ahead. That is not a lever any one person pulls, but it is a lever, and it is still, right now, within reach. I lay all of that out not to turn this into a lecture, but because it is the antidote to the two lies I spent this whole part dismantling. The denier tells you there is no ceiling, so relax. The catastrophist tells you the ceiling is upon us, and nothing can be done, so despair. Both of them, in the end, recommend the same thing, which is to sit still and do nothing. The truth is the only version of this story that asks something of you, and also offers something back, because it says the ceiling is real but our distance from it is not yet fixed, that people are dying now in ways we know how to prevent, and that the size of the danger a generation from now is still genuinely being decided. That is a heavier thing to carry than either comforting lie. It is also the only one of the three that is true, and the only one that leaves any room to act. Let me show you how attribution science actually works, because it is the tool that turns its just summer from an opinion into a testable claim, and once you see the method you cannot unsee it. When a heatwave hits, scientists build a detailed computer model of the atmosphere and run it thousands of times to see how often an event that's severe shows up in the world as it is today. Then they change one thing. They strip the extra heat-trapping gases back out of the model, rebuilding a virtual copy of the cooler world of a century ago, and they run it thousands of times again, counting how often the same severe event appears in that version. The gap between the two counts is the answer. It tells you, in hard numbers, how much more likely the warming made this particular event. And for heatwaves specifically, the answer keeps coming back stark. Many recent deadly heat waves were found to be tens or even hundreds of times more likely because of the warming, and some were judged to have been all but impossible in the cooler world of the past. That is not a slogan. It is a measurement, repeatable, checkable, done the same way every time. There is an uncomfortable fairness question threaded through all of this that I would be dishonest to skip. The people who will feel the wet bulb ceiling first and worst, the populations of the Persian Gulf Coast, the South Asian river valleys, the crowded plains of the global south, are largely not the people who put most of the carbon into the air. The heat is arriving first in the places that did the least to cause it, and that have the fewest resources to defend against it, while the regions that burned the most fuel sight, for now, further from the ceiling and better equipped to cool themselves. I am not raising that to assign blame or turn this into a sermon. I am raising it because it is a physical fact about where on the map the danger lands, and because it explains why this is not a problem any single country can wall itself away from. Heat that drives people from their homes does not respect the borders of who caused it. The consequences travel, and they travel toward everyone, which means that even from the coldest, most self-interested angle, the ceiling on the far side of the world is not somebody else's problem. It is the leading edge of a pressure that reaches all of us. I should give the current heat wave one more honest piece of context before we close. because it connects to the warmed baseline underneath all of this. Layered on top of the long-term warming right now is a natural pattern in the Pacific Ocean called El Niño, a periodic warming of the tropical Pacific that tends to nudge global temperatures upward for a year or two. The Pacific is in that warm phase right now, running well into El Niño territory, and I have talked about its arrival on this channel before as the strengthening backdrop to this whole restless season. El Niño is not the cause of the long-term trend, and when it fades, some of this extra warmth will ease. But it is the amplifier of the moment, the natural swing riding on top of the human-made rise, and it is part of why the summer of 2026 is delivering the heat it is. The baseline keeps climbing, and every few years a natural warm phase lifts the whole thing higher still, and in those years the dice come up hot more often than not. That is the machinery behind the warnings scrolling across the country today, and it leaves us with one last question, the one I promised in the very first minute, the terrifying implication itself, finally stated plainly. If the ceiling is real, and the planet has already touched it, and the direction is set, then how much of the Earth becomes too hot for human life in the century ahead, and are we actually ready to hear the answer? Let's bring it home. Part 9. The answer. You aren't ready to hear. Let me gather the whole thing into one place, because we have travelled a long way from a hot holiday afternoon, and the shape of the argument matters as much as any single piece of it. We started with your own body, with the furnace inside you, and the single elegant tool it uses to survive the heat, the evaporation of sweat. We found that this tool has a hard limit, a wet bulb temperature above which it simply stops working, and that a healthy person held above that limit dies within hours no matter what they do. We learned that the real limit is lower than the famous number, closer to 31 degrees than 35 and lower still for the old and the sick. We saw that the planet has already touched the ceiling briefly in a few places, and that the frequency of these extreme events has doubled in about 40 years. We saw the map of who reaches it first, the warm coasts and the flooded valleys where a fifth of humanity lives. We watched the comfortable band that our species has occupied for 6,000 years begin to slide off the places where billions of people actually live, and then we went back tens of millions of years to watch the Earth run this experiment twice before, once as a fever that reshaped the bodies of mammals, and once as a catastrophe that turned the living tropics into a silent equatorial dead zone. That is the staircase. That is the whole staircase. From the sweat on your skin today to the rock record of the worst day life ever had. So here is the answer to the question in the title, the terrifying implication, stated as plainly and as honestly as I know how. The heatwave hitting the country today is not, in itself, the disaster. It is a messenger, and the message it carries is that heat has a ceiling for human life, that the ceiling is real and physical and already within reach in the hottest corners of the planet, and that the direction we are travelling widens the zone that can touch it, decade by decade, across the century ahead. That is the implication. Not that today is the end, but that today is a data point on a curve, and the curve bends toward a wall that the Earth itself has shown us is real. The phrase too hot for human life is not hypothetical. It is a category that exists, that has a temperature attached to it, that the planet has produced before and is beginning to produce again in flashes. That is what you are not ready to hear. Not a prophecy of doom, but something stranger and harder to hold. The quiet fact that a limit we assumed was theoretical has quietly become a thing that happens. And now I have to tell you the part that the doommongers leave out, because they need you frozen, and the truth does not. The size of the answer is not fixed. When scientists project how much of the Earth crosses into these dangerous conditions, and how many people end up outside the livable band, they never give a single number. They give a range, and the range is enormous, and the reason it is so wide is that it depends almost entirely on choices that have not been made yet. The difference between a future where the danger stays confined to a few of the hottest coasts, and a future where it spreads across a fifth of the planet's land and reaches 1 to 3 billion people, is not written in the stars. It is not decided by the sun or by some secret machine or by fate. It is decided by how much more carbon we pour into the air in the decades in front of us. The wall is real, but our distance from it is still genuinely up to us. That is not a comforting thought exactly, because it means the responsibility is ours and the time is short. but it is the opposite of hopeless, and I will not let you leave here believing it is hopeless, because that belief is just denial wearing a darker coat. Think about what that actually means for the way you hold all of this. The heat that killed more than 700 people in Chicago, the heat that broke a temperate rainforest town in a single afternoon and then burned it down, the brief lethal spikes on the shore of the Persian Gulf, the 400 million people on a plane in China living toward a dangerous future, the billions who may find themselves outside the band our species has always called home. All of that is real, and none of it is destiny. Every one of those outcomes sits somewhere on a slope, and the steepness of the slope is set by the sum of an enormous number of decisions, technological, political, personal, made over the years directly ahead. We are not passengers watching the temperature climb through the window. We are collectively with our hands on the controls, and the fact that no single one of us is steering does not change the fact that all of us together are. There is something almost vertiginous about being the generation that can see this clearly. For all of human history, the wet bulb ceiling sat out there, real but irrelevant, a cliff at the far edge of a field no one was walking across. Our ancestors lived and died without ever needing to know the number, because their world never came close to it. We are the first people who have both the science to see the ceiling precisely and the collective power to change how fast we approach it. That is a strange and heavy inheritance. It would be easier, in a way, not to know. It would be easier to believe the deniers and feel nothing, or to believe the catastrophists and give up because both of those let you off the hook. Knowing the truth, the real calibrated truth, is the only version that leaves you holding something, and what it leaves you holding is a choice about degree. Not whether the ceiling exists, the Permian settled that, but how close we choose to walk to it, and how many people we leave standing in its shadow. So the next time a heatwave rolls across the country, and the warnings scroll across your screen, and some part of you files it as just another hot week, I want you to remember what is underneath the number your app is showing you. I want you to remember that there is a hidden temperature, the wet bulb temperature, that measures how well the air will let a human body cool itself, and that this hidden number has a ceiling, and that the ceiling is real and lower than they told you and already being touched at the edges of the world. I want you to remember that heat past a certain line does not just make us uncomfortable, it closes the last exit the body has. And I want you to remember that the Earth has stood at the top of this staircase before and left the tropics silent, and that we are undeniably on the same staircase, climbing, with the pace of the climb still in our hands. Before we let the heat wave fade into memory, I want to hand you something to actually hold, because a story like this can leave a person feeling small and frozen, and that is the opposite of what the truth should do. Start with the simplest thing. You now know a number almost no one around you knows. You understand that underneath the temperature on the app, there is a hidden measurement, the wet bulb temperature, that decides whether the air will let a body cool itself, and that this measurement has a ceiling, and that the ceiling is real and already being brushed at the edges of the world. That knowledge changes how you see every future heat wave, and it changes who you can protect. It is the reason you might check on an elderly neighbour on the 4th dangerous day instead of the 1st, knowing now that it is the accumulation and the sleepless nights that do the killing. Understanding the mechanism is not a small thing. It is the difference between watching a warning scroll past and knowing what it actually means. Then there is the longer view, the one that puts this moment in its proper place in time. We are, as far as we can tell, the first generation of human beings able to see this ceiling clearly, to measure it, to know where it sits and how the planet approaches it. Every generation before us lived and died without needing the number, because their world never came near it. Generations after us will live with the consequences of what happens to the number in the decades directly ahead. That puts us in a strange and pivotal position, holding a piece of knowledge that is both a burden and a kind of power, because a threat you can see and measure is a threat you can, at least in principle, do something about. The people of the ancient fevers had no idea what was happening to them. We do. That awareness is the one genuine advantage our moment holds over every heat catastrophe in the planet's long memory, and it would be a strange kind of failure to waste it by looking away. And that is why I keep coming back to the single most important word in all of this, which is range. Not a fixed doom, not a single terrible number waiting for us, but a range, wide open, its final value still unwritten, its outcome resting on choices that have not been made. The Permian showed us the top of the staircase. The present shows us the lowest steps, the ones we are standing on now. Everything in between is not destiny, but decision, and the difference between the gentler futures and the darkest ones is measured in exactly the thing that is still, today, within human hands to change. So hold both truths at once, because they are both real. The ceiling is fixed and ancient and indifferent. Our distance from it is not. That is the whole terrifying, strangely hopeful shape of it, and it is why the question the heat is really asking is not a question about the weather at all. The heat outside your window today will break. The dome will drift. The front will pass. The temperature will fall. And in a few days this particular wave will be a memory, the way they always become memories. But the ceiling it pointed at will still be there when the cool air returns, unchanged, patient, waiting at the top of the field. It was there before this heat wave, and it will be there after, and it does not care whether we believe in it or argue about it or look away from it. It is a fact about the human body, and a fact about the planet, and the only thing that is actually still open, the only thing not yet decided, is how much of this earth we allow to become a place where a living person, doing everything right, in the shade, with water, can no longer survive the air. That is the question the heat is really asking, and the answer, the whole terrifying and strangely hopeful answer, is that we are the ones who get to write it. So the real question was never how hot it is today. The real question is what we do now that we finally know where the line is.